Oh my gosh. That music. I keep trying to find new songs, a new playlist, and that one was something else. Um, it was called Song of Little Ducks, and this was supposed to be a getting focused playlist. Thank you, Druid. Oh my goodness. Oh yes, it was a little Barney-ish. And it's not the children's playlist. That's the funny thing. Oh my goodness, you guys. Happy Monday. Oh, Druid, my darling. Mario Dim, hello. Robin, hi. Oh my goodness. He liked it anyway. Yeah, you know, romper room. Yeah. You're so annoyed by the music, you're like, let me just get to work. Yeah, it went from like this kind of happy upbeat tune, and I was like, hey, that sounds good. And then it went like really low, and I was like, this is not good for a Monday. This is a little too slow. And then it went romper room, so. And of course there was the dance of the kitties. So, did you guys have a good weekend? I hope that you did something fun or something relaxing, or I don't know. What do you wish for weekends? I wanted to have a productive weekend. And I think I pretty much did. But it was one of those weekends where, you know, you do a whole bunch of stuff. And then you look around you on Sunday night and you're like, what did I get done? Because, like, things are a bigger mess than they were before. And it doesn't look like it was productive. But I did get some things done. I went through a bunch of quilts and stuff, and I took a whole bunch of my own artwork to my new storage space, and that was like a huge weight lifted off, because I had a couple pieces that were just kind of floating around the house because they didn't have a good place to be. And they're big, they're in boxes and stuff, so really glad to get that stuff in a safe, you know, temperature controlled, and I don't have to worry about it. I pay these people $50 a month to keep my crap locked up and safe. So that was a lot of this weekend, and I've kind of working on the last little bits of my presentation for seminar, which starts next week. And I should probably really quick before I forget, remind you guys of the schedule for September. Let me share my other screen so you can see it. So the rest of this week is business as usual. But next week, Jill and I will be releasing some quilt nerding videos to keep you in suspense while we're at seminar. So look out for those on Monday and Friday. We'll have them auto release, and you can see them on the Quilt Nerding YouTube. The rest of the week, no streams, because we're at a hotel, a Marriott in New York, and already know that Wi-Fi is going to be bad. So, and we're so busy. I was looking at our schedule, and I'm like, when do I have time to like breathe and sleep and go to the bathroom? I think there's so much you try to plug into, and I don't know if you've been to conferences or symposiums or seminars, whatever. It always seems like there's not enough time to do all the things you want to do. So, and it's exciting and it's fun, but it's also frustrating from that perspective because you're like, I know I'm not going to get to spend the time I want with people, or, I'm going to have to like dine and dash kind of situation. So, and I mean dine and dash, like eat and run, and not pay the bill. So, so next week you can catch up on quilt nerding if you want. Otherwise, we're not here. When we come back the following week, I will not be streaming that Monday either, just because it's a travel day for me. We'll be back normal time Tuesday night for Quilt Nerding in the Book Club. We're starting to read, to make sure I give it a plug, we're starting to read Soft Covers for Hard Times by Mary Kay Waldvogel. Very exciting. And then Jill and I are going to do a dual stream on Friday night that following week. So Friday the 13th. It'll be here and it'll be on Quilt Nerding, but it'll be at night on Friday night. So, and then the rest of the month is business as usual. Jill and I have reduced needlework nights down to one night a week. If you've been following along with that, that was Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. on YouTube. But we've reduced it down to once a month, just because it was a lot of work for us. And it's rough for me to stream 4 days a week back to back. So, but look out for that, because we're going to be looking at mucklean, and that might be something that you don't know a lot about. I know I didn't until recently. So that'll be kind of a fun little romp through some needlework. Ooh, Robin, what did you do? So purging, reorganizing. Yeah, that's always good. Let loose of fabrics. Yeah, projects you're not going to do. Yeah, as much as stuff like that always stresses me out to think about, I've got all this. I did that this weekend too, as I was, reorganizing and pulling out, my stuff to take to my artwork to take to the storage space. I was looking at some fabric and I'm like, oh my God, I've got so much fabric. I've forgotten about like these 2 whole boxes of fat quarters I had from probably 20 plus years ago. So yeah, and I was thinking like, I still like some of these. But I was like, no, you need to pull this out and get rid of it and find somebody who can use it right away. So yeah, I think it is fun to kind of organizing is kind of fun. It's something I procrastinate on, and I'm like, ooh, I don't want to do it. But once you get into it, it can actually be a little bit fun, because you discover things. Yeah, you reorganized your works in progress. Yeah. Mara Dim, I feel like you always have something in progress because you've got that haul of stuff. So in my going through things this weekend, of course, I found some stuff to share. Um, that's the beautiful thing about finding things you forgot you had. So for one thing, we were talking, Robin, I love that. Reorganizing to prove to your husband that the majority of the mess belongs to him. I try that all the time. It never works out in my favor. My husband is a photographer. That's his thing. And I'm hoping that when he retires from public service, that he can kind of make more of a full-time thing with photography. So he has lots of equipment, but somehow big pieces of photography equipment just don't take up as much room as fabric. Like, fabric is such a, it can take any shape. It can fold up small. It still takes up a lot of space. Anyway, so I was always finding things. Actually, one thing I'd been looking for. So, I've shown Crazy Quilts here a bunch of times. We've talked Crazy Quilts. At Quilt Nerding, we read, book before last, we read Penny McMorris's Crazy Quilts book. And I think we learned a lot. It was a really interesting read. But along the way, I knew I had a black velvet painted piece that was meant to go in a Crazy Quilt. And for the life of me, I couldn't remember what I did with it. Well, of course I found it this weekend. So this is it. And, it's got a kind of a weird orientation, I think. You can see. And then up close, you can see the brush marks. And this is that, this was a technique that was described. And when I first got this piece, I got it as part of, oh gosh, there's a hole in it. I had gotten it with these other pieces. I'm going to show you another one in a second. And I kind of looked at it and I was like, well, it is ugly. And it's not really. It's really not ugly. It's painted with oil paint. So it's got, it's got texture. You can see. ASMR for you. So yeah, it's kind of got these chunky bits. So it's the kind of thing, if it was sewn into a quilt, it probably would not have lasted this long, as it looks. And it has some deterioration. Like, I just apparently put my finger through a hole there. But I would think that this would have flaked off. If this was in a quilt, even if it was something that was just, thrown over the back of a chair or piano quilt, that kind of thing. That's what they use Crazy Quilts for, either as a slumber throw, just for covering yourself when you napped, or for pretty things, right? Just for pretty, as the Pennsylvania Dutch say. So yeah, velvet painting. And of course that was my first inclination. I was like, and the interesting thing is, when I bought this Crazy Quilt stuff, I wasn't planning on getting this. I didn't realize I was getting this. The guy threw it in. So I was kind of like, oh, thank you for throwing in this Velvet Elvis. But on closer examination, I had to remind myself that this is historically significant. It is something that they actually did back then. So as a piece to study, it's very interesting. It's, again, it's the kind of thing that, it's what they did back then. And it's not, it is what it is. It's not something that's drop dead gorgeous, but it's pretty and it's interesting. So velvet painting, there. Now this piece, and I have to admit, this is terrible. I forget sometimes the things I have. This piece is really fascinating. And first of all, I will show you. It's got random pieces of fabric stitched in, and there's this one piece that's under here that's so fascinating, and I'm afraid velvet square rigger ship painting. I know exactly what you're talking about, those kind of things. But yeah, this is a piece of crazy quilting that is in progress, and it's got some cool stuff on it. It's not in great shape. It's got the shattering silks, but so this corner, got this beautiful red corner, But underneath, look at this fabric. You can't even see this fabric. On the front of the quilt, for some reason they sewed that piece of blue or that piece of red over it. But look at it. There was this itty bitty these little figures on it, and I don't know, what it was. I don't want to pull this too hard and start it unraveling because it's just basted together. But you can see there's like a little floral stuff on it. So I don't know if it was like some kind of scarf or I don't know. But anyway, I just love finding little tidbits like that. But anyway, here's the whole thing. And so it's not that big, probably 18 inches, something like that. But it's got some of the hallmarks of a crazy quilt. You've got the spider web, and you've got lots of plaids and silks, polka dots. There's this committee ribbon right here. And then there's another ribbon. Where is it? Here it is. I don't know. It's got the number 24 on it. I don't know what that was from. Some kind of ribbon. And then, just some interesting, and it's all silks. I don't think there's any other fiber in here. The backing of it is this plaid. I don't think this is homespun, but it's, it's a kind of a timeless plaid. So anyway, knowing that the peak of crazy quilting was around 1883, 1884, that would be my guess as to how old it is. But anyway, really neat piece. It's fun to look at, and it's fun because you can see, this one was a neat little embroidery on velvet. You can see how they did this. They had this backing, whatever that backing is, some scrap fabric or whatever, and then they would baste the stuff down, and then they would apply those fancy stitches. Well, this one never got the stitches, so a fun thing. Just as interesting as the velvet flowers. And also, and I don't think I said it here, I said it on Quilt Nerding, as we were looking at crazy quilts. I think it was like actually it might have been the day that Jill showed crazy quilts and the Stitch Punk exhibit from the New England Quilt Museum. And then she showed a piece that she had made some time ago that was kind of a contained crazy. And I was like, you know what? I have never made a crazy quilt. Well, guess what, guys? I lied. I have still not really made a crazy quilt, but I had one in progress I had completely forgot about. Here it is. I would say it's a little less crazy, a little bit more improv piecing. It does have little words on it that I'm in the process of embroidering with silk thread, but it's all made out of pieces from vintage kimonos. You can see I started doing some of the, placemat size. I started doing some of the little fancy stitches. But anyway, I pulled this out. I thought, I'm going to finish this. It just really needs the fancy stitches and to finish up the little saying. And the little saying here is: number 1, pick up the pieces. Number 2, dust them off. Number 3, salvage the best. Number 4, let the rest go. And number 5, the cycle continues. So I thought this one was kind of a cool piece. I'm feeling like a dummy for never finishing it. So those are some of the things I found. Also, you may see this guy. I've forgotten I made him. As I was going through some stuff, my work, I had in a little bin, and I wanted to use the bin for something, so I was like, all this stuff I made going in the big bin. And I had been working on some patterns, a series of like Halloween themed needlework patterns, and this is one of them. Applique, the creature from the Black Lagoon. So he's my favorite horror guy. And then finally, part of my Sunbonnet Sue presentation at seminar really looks at like the social implications of Sunbonnet Sue and her cuteness and etc., etc. And I started reading this book a while back called Pink Globalization, Hello Kitty's Trek Across the Pacific, which is a really academic view of Hello Kitty. Like, some parts of it are super dense. But the author, Christine Yano, has some interesting things to say, and she did some interesting interviews, and, there's a whole section here called The Business of Hating Hello Kitty. So I'm not going to reveal a whole lot of it here because it is part of my presentation, but Hello Kitty, I think she suffered the same fate in many ways as Sunbonnet Sue. She's over commodified. She's too cute. She's kind of sickening at times. The whole Japanese kawaii phenomenon, she's tied up in that. There's a lot of parallels between Sunbonnet Sue here in the U.S. and, Hello Kitty and what she means, what we've done with her. So, I have to admit, I have a Sanrio problem. I had a Sanrio problem. There was a little shop in the town I grew up in, and it wasn't a Hallmark per se, but they had the kind of stuff a Hallmark would have, like stationery and I don't know, like stuff. It was like a boutique. And honestly, I don't remember what else they had because I really couldn't have cared less. The only reason I wanted to go there was because they had Sanrio stuff. I was about 8 years old, and my mom worked in the fabric store that was in the same shopping center. So at 8 years old, if I could get any amount of money, little bits of allowance, little bits of birthday and Christmas money, I would buy Hello Kitty stuff. And, it'd be like a little box of erasers, or I know one time I had, it was itty bitty little stationery set. Really cute stuff. So Hello Kitty, My Melody, there's a bunch of other characters. I won't go through them all now. But as I got older, and so Sanrio kind of, they were always in the U.S., but they kind of, not phased out Hello Kitty, but just couldn't find them as much. You couldn't find her as much. Like when I was in high school, Hello Kitty was like nowhere. But she had a resurgence when I was just out of college, young mother, and for some reason, well, I don't want to say for some reason because I know why. I had collected a few small Hello Kitty things because I was like, oh, she's back. There's a Sanrio store at a mall near me. It's a very bad. Still to this day, I'm like not going in there because I don't need stuffed animals. I'm a 50-year-old woman. But in the early 2000s, I did start collecting Hello Kitty stuff again. I don't have anything left from when I was a child because those things were little tiny things like erasers and pencils that got used up. But I do have more than a few little kitty babies. I've had these forever. They're up on a shelf in my upstairs area. But I mean, look at her. Is she not the cutest? And her little hood here. There's a little cheetah. And she's a mermaid. Look at her. Doo-doo. Little Ariel. Bzz, 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 bzz. She's not a bee. I'm a dummy. She's a ladybug, right? A little ladybug, little spots. The Hello Kitty locker of candy. I mean, they made so much stuff. It's got the little lock and key with it. Hello Kitty notebook. These are just a few of the things. And this is all stuff I did not buy myself. I think maybe these little guys I might have purchased. The rest of this were gifts. People at my work would give me stuff. My husband would give me stuff. I finally had to say, please stop. So anyway, I have a proliferation of these things, and it all kind of is coming full circle to me as I look at the concept of cute, the concept of Barbara Brackman calls Sunbonnet Sue a sentimental cliche, and so I feel like that kind of stuff really, that terminology really kind of encompasses this stuff too. So anyway, I wanted to share the Hello Kitties with you because I don't know. What does it say about a 50-year-old woman that has a whole room full of toys? I don't know. I like toys. I need a granddaughter. Yeah, I needed a daughter. That's what I needed. Yeah, luckily my son he was of course not a Hello Kitty person, but he, I think he kind of liked Karapi, which is the frog, Batsmaru, who is the angry penguin, and then I think, you know, from Sanrio, it's an easy hop over to like Pokemon, stuff like that. So the whole Japanese, you know, manga and anime, and then like the whole kawaii phenomenon, it's a thing. But yes, I do need a young child, a little girl to pass these things down to. I also did some reading this weekend, believe it or not. And of course, it was probably why I looked around and said, how I got nothing done. I think it's because I did things, but then I put nothing away and just went and read. So one of the things I've been reading, which it's really fascinating, and I think I want to read some of it to you guys at some point. It's a textbook. It's called Textile Conservation, and they came out with a new edition of it. So that's why this copy was cheap. That's the thing that really, you know, I don't want to digress here, but the thing that really burns me up sometimes is you have these really great books that get put out by professors, and, you know, they're available to the general public, but they're so expensive. And I'm like, I can understand this being like, you know, a decently expensive book when it first comes out, you know, especially if it was in hardcover. This is the softcover edition. But, you know, why does this book have to be $70? You know, even if the authors like self-published it, it still would not cost them nearly, you know, it's just one of those things. It's like a commodity, and I don't like that. I feel like textbooks they're onerous for students and people that just want to, you know, sort of autodidactic, you know, just teach themselves things or learn things. It's really out of reach for people sometimes. So anyway, I will often buy books if it's a textbook that I've had on my wish list. When a new issue or a new edition of it comes out, if it's not too outdated, sometimes the ones that involve technology are a little too outdated. But then I'll go snag an old edition of it. So there's at least one essay in here that I think is really good, and I would like to read it to you guys. So this is out of England, out of the UK. So although I think there's case studies from the US in here, if I remember correctly. In any event, be violating some copyrights, but I still think it's good stuff to read. So stay tuned for that. I'm gonna keep reading, and I'll cherry pick some good stuff for you guys. Also read some Nietzsche this weekend, which I'm not gonna bore you with, but perspectivism. If you are ever, you know, want to have a deep thinky think, read up on perspectivism. It's a really interesting, like, philosophical concept. So let's get to the content. I'll put all these kitties aside. And we've got Lady of Goatees. But first, we're going to read what Frieda Rollings has to say. Oh, Maradim, you've given your toys to your grandchildren bit by bit. Aw. Yeah, my mom, I think a lot of my mom's toys when she was little, actually, I played with. And she always blames me of destroying them. And I'm like, no, I didn't. I may have once or twice dropped the teapot. But I took good care of the toys. So, to remind you, I got a copy of, I think it was June 1974, Quilter's newsletter magazine. A dear friend sent it to me, specific to some things that were in it that had to do with my research. Well, in looking at it with you guys, I was like, what have we here? And it was this particular piece called Pages from a Quilter's Journal, and it said page number 4 by Frieda Rollings. And I was like, I don't understand this page number 4 thing, but let's go with it. Well, as it turns out, Frieda Rollings was writing this Pages from a Quilter's Journal series for the magazine, and this went from March of 74 to December of 74, so it was almost the whole year. She did, I guess it's 10, yeah, it was 10 different articles. So I thought we would start reading them, and you know, I like to get to the halfway point and then switch over to the book. So we'll see how far we get on these. They're just, I mean, they're pretty simple articles, so I'm thinking maybe we can get through most of them. I'll skip the one I read the other day. But it's interesting stuff because it's this woman was basically running, as from what I can tell, I have not read these in detail because I wanted to read them with you, but she was running a business. She was doing quilting for people. She quilted on her machine, domestic machine quilting, which if you've ever done is tough. It is, you know, it's not as simple as, I don't like to do it because it's hard to wrestle any size of quilt bigger than, like, say, a crib quilt through a domestic sewing machine. You have to have things, you know, supported, and it's just kind of tough, and it's really easy to get puckers and, you know, that kind of stuff. It's just, I've just never had luck myself. So I have a lot of respect for people that can do it well, and can make a business out of it. Or I don't know, even if it wasn't a business, although I think it kind of was, she was doing a lot of quilting this way. So I'm interested to see what she has to say. So we're going to start with what she calls page number 1 from the Quilter's Journal. And this is March 1974, Quilter's Newsletter magazine. At the time, they actually were just Quilter's Newsletter. They added the magazine part later. But the byline did, or the whatever you call what are they? The byline is who the author is. What do you call that? It's like part of the masthead, I think. They called it the Magazine for Quilt Lovers. So, Pages from a Quilter's Journal by Frieda Rollings. Have a little sip while I wait for this ad break to stop. Okay. Pages from a Quilter's Journal by Frieda Rollings. Right. Frieda Rollings at her machine with one of her quilts. So that's this picture. There's Frieda. She looks like a very nice lady. This quilt was pictured in the March 1971 Family Circle magazine. So, I mean, she's quilting these things on a domestic machine, and she's getting them in magazines. So she must be good at what she does. It is made of red and blue bandana kerchiefs and is filled with unglazed dacron. This filler makes a very puffy quilt. I think everything made in the 70s was filled with dacron, or dacron, however you say it. Just AKA polyester filling. These quilts will last forever. The fabric on them will eventually go away, but the middle will be there. The dacron batting will never die. Notice the size of the roll to her left. So you can see, it's kind of a little bit hard to see, but it's just all this puffiness here. That's the other part of the quilt that she's not quilting right at that moment. Mrs. Rollings began quilting when she bought this machine about 18 years ago. It's a Singer. I think I've mentioned to you guys before, even though I'm into old sewing machines, I can never get the model numbers right. Our friend Kenny, he's into machines right now, and refurbishing them, and he knows all the numbers, and I think there's a number of you here that do too. So anyway, maybe you can tell what it is by looking at it. It's got a potted motor, I think. That's about as good as I can I could get it. So it'd be 1950s. Okay. So she began quilting when she bought this machine about 18 years ago. A friend saw the fancy stitches it made and requested a custom-made quilt. Since then, Mrs. Rollings has always had a backlog of quilts to do. In the past 5 years, she has quilted over 750 quilts on her machine. It is a regular sewing machine for home sewing, not a commercial quilting machine. So this is 1974. At this point, they do have commercial quilting machines. And what my mom told me was that, you know, these commercial quilting machines were not really, I mean, they were not accessible to the public for the most part. People couldn't afford, you know, I mean, a long arm today, huge investment. But there is that possibility of the business you can get from a long arm. At this time, I mean, probably what Frieda Rollings was doing might have been a little bit, you know, women had always taken in quilting, you know, done quilting, piecing, marking, all that stuff as a business. But, you know, to sew in the sewing machine, she probably was one of, I mean, not a whole lot of people doing this. I'm guessing. I could be totally wrong, but I'm pretty sure not a whole lot of ladies just taking in, you know, quilting requests. But there were companies that did commercial quilting, and my guess is they did the quilting for like bedspreads and comforters. I mean, comforters weren't necessarily a thing then, I don't think. But like bedspreads, they would do the quilting for those. And I have a polyester double knit quilt. It's actually a comforter because it is so puffy. It's like this thick. My cats love it, so I've let them have it. I keep it on the couch. It keeps them off the couch and on this quilt. And I could not for the life of me figure out how they must have gotten it quilted because, again, it's puffy. It's probably like 4 layers of Dacron or some kind of polyester. It's really puffy. And my mom said, well, there were companies where you could send something off. And if you look at my piece, it's quilted not like a traditional quilt. It's quilted like a comforter. And so it kind of does like this kind of swirly thing, like in like really big patches where it just kind of crisscrosses. It's not really not a cable. It's just kind of a crisscrossing. And if you've really looked at a comforter, if you ever had a big puffy comforter on your bed, you know what I'm talking about. It's like this sort of circular crisscrossing. So my mom said, very good chance that particular quilt / comforter that I have was done in a commercial setting. And she said, you know, either it was somebody that had access, you know, like maybe a family member that worked for, or they themselves worked for a commercial stitching place, or they had a place they could send it to. So she says, I was proud of the quilting I had done on Mrs. Carter's quilt. But when she came for it today, she exclaimed, oh dear, I thought if I used Dacron, it would be puffier. Oh my. I wish Mrs. Carter had told me she wanted a puffy quilt. Here are some of the things we could have done about it. Number 1, she was right in buying Dacron for her quilt. It is much puffier than cotton. Number 2, I could have quilted it less. The puffier you wish a quilt to be, the less you will quilt it. Dacron does not wad up, so less quilting is practical. And I think that's the deal with the thing I have. It does not have close, you know, natural looking quilting stitches. It's just like the, you know, just to kind of hold the whole thing together. Number 3, some manufacturers now put out an extra thick Dacron, or 1.5 to 2 layers of regular Dacron can be used. Most glazed Dacron can be split, but this leaves an unglazed surface on each piece. Care should be taken to turn this down on either the lining or the full layer of Dacron. It will catch on the seams of a pieced top if turned up, making it hard to straighten. So what she's saying is if you peel the batting apart, one side of it would have been, like the outer sides would have been like she's saying glazed. I don't know how they did it. I mean, maybe it was some type of chemical or something. I just kind of assume they like pressed it and it kind of melted on the outside. I don't know. But yeah, this glazing must have meant there's some kind of finish on there. But you could peel it apart. But what she's saying is if you have that piece that, you know, this is the glazed side and then this is the peeled apart side, it's going to be like, you know, wanting to grab the fabric. So she's saying either put that fuzzy side down on the other piece of the Dacron or put it against the back of the quilt. Good advice. Let's see. Incidentally, the other half of this split Dacron could be used in a quilt that requires only a little filler. So often I am asked to sew top to lining with no filler, and I suggest instead this half layer of Dacron be used. It adds nothing materially to the weight of the quilt, yet it looks so much more quilted. Number 4, if 1.5 or 2 layers of Dacron are used to make a puffy quilt, you must remember that the puff will take up some of the dimensions of the quilt. In other words, if a very thick quilt is desired, both top and bottom must be larger than the dimensions needed for the finished quilt. I wouldn't have thought of this. And it's smart. It's something you need to know if you're going to make something that's big and puffy. You have to expect that it's going to shrink up some of the quilt by the time you start, quilting it. Even if it's not densely quilted, it's still going to suck some of the fabric in. In the future, I must ask my customers, how puffy do you want your quilt? How close together should it be quilted? Mrs. Carter is making another quilt, and this one we will make really puff. So that was page 1. Okay, page 2. So this is from April of 74, the following month. And she says, Mrs. Moore brought me 2 quilts to quilt for the red, white, and blue bedroom she is planning for her boys. They are in Job's Troubles pattern, one red with a red print and white, the other blue with a blue print and white. I feel like, this is 74, so still a couple years to the bicentennial, but I feel like, red, white, and blue was really big at this point. I just feel like the 70s were, and I don't know if people were gearing up for the bicentennial. I kind of feel like in 74, maybe they weren't. I feel like red, white, and blue and, those kind of colonial revival type of things. There was, I have, it's sort of patriotic looking printed stuff. But again, it's not necessarily bicentennial. I guess this stuff was just popular at that time. I found only one piece of lining, a nice piece of 90-inch material perfect for quilting. And after much measuring, I decided the only way it would make 2 linings of the required size was to cut them crosswise. So I guess what she's saying is it was 90 inches this way, which is perfect. They didn't really make a lot of yardage at that time that was like that. It was probably some type of specialty yardage. You would have to, today it's 108-inch backings that they make, so you don't have to stitch together something. But what she's saying, this 90 inches across would be great for like twin beds, which is probably what it was. But she had to cut it in half so that then you get 2 quilts out of it, is what I think she's saying. Let's see, had to cut them crosswise. If that is what she wanted, she would have told me, I thought. Had I cut one lengthwise, the other would surely have had to be pieced. I have found blue and red thread with the quilts, and with the blue quilt rolled and pinned. I was threading the machine with blue thread when I noticed a scrap of paper had fallen from the sack that had contained the quilt. Uh-oh. Use the blue thread on the red quilt and the red thread on the blue quilt, it read. This different colored thread has made the quilt very interesting and tied the 2 together, but I found that note just in time. If instructions are left for a quilter, they should be pinned to the outside of the sack or box, or on the outside, to the outside of the sack or box, or to the outside of the sack or box. Oh, I guess that was a typo. Or on each individual quilt. They should include name, address, and telephone number. They should also include information about the following. Do you want your quilt bound or hemmed? Have you included the binding? What color of thread should be used in quilting? Do you intend to hem the top under for binding? I remember spending a frustrating time piecing out a too small lining, only to have the lady tell me she had purposefully made it smaller, expecting to turn the top under for binding. Do you expect to turn the lining up for binding? So I think what she's saying here is, quilts could have, when it's finished, you could turn the front over the back and bind it that way, or you could turn the back to the front and bind it that way, or you could have a separate piece of binding. Let's see. Do you expect to turn the lining up for the binding? If this is the case, the quilter must leave extra lining on all sides. So yeah, your backing should be bigger if it's going to turn to the front. It can be smaller if you're going to turn to the back. Although I always feel like it's a bad idea to make your backing any smaller than the quilt itself, because that shifting, I personally, ask me how I know, have quilted something on the machine just doing like diagonal lines and then turned the thing over and went, oh great. The whole thing shifted because the back was so tightly, not enough. And so then I had this whole edging that the front was quilted, but the back had no backing. It was just like this much, all batting. Ugh. So yeah, I think it's always a bad idea unless you're hand quilting, and you can kind of keep an eye on that. Once you get to machine quilting, things happen. Also, you should let your quilter know if your quilt's corners aren't quite square. If it is bigger at one end than the other, if there is extra fullness in spots, or any other error you have made. She may be able to correct or camouflage these errors, and if not, she will know you are aware of them. When your quilting needle becomes dull or snags the material, it can easily be sharpened by rubbing the point against an emery board. That's a top tip. And then the rest of this page is pattern collector stuff. So, very interesting. Okay. So this is page number 3. It is very, very pretty, and you've done a wonderful job, Mrs. Martin enthused. But of course, I think hand quilting is always better, don't you? I wanted to disagree loudly. Hand quilting is not always better, but of course I didn't. Mrs. Martin's quilt would have been next to impossible to quilt by hand. It was colorful and gay, but mixed with percale were prints of sailcloth and denim. Far too heavy to hand quilt. Oh my gosh. Sailcloth and denim. Sailcloth would be like heavy, it's like heavy cotton canvas kind of stuff. The pale green drip dry sheet that she had provided for lining and the thread of the same shade had made the quilt outstanding. But I couldn't imagine quilting a drip dry sheet by hand. So drip dry sheets would be, percale would be like I don't think they would be 100% polyester. I think they would be, it's a poly cotton, and it's the polyester that makes the cotton not, be wrinkly. So one of the advantages of machine quilting is that almost any material can be used for quilts. Then there is what I would call the now quilt. Machine quilted in a hurry and have it now. I needed a bedspread in a hurry because company was coming. Anybody ever done that? I can't say I've ever made a quilt because company was coming, but I have made an outfit for some type of event when I had something perfectly good already in my closet to wear, but I was like, I just gotta make this. I'm sure many of you have done this too. My new spread was made the same day of drapery material and cotton filler, which I machine quilted to a muslin lining. An emergency bedspread has never happened to me. Yeah, I have to say that one is that's quite a feat in my opinion. In this same category are the utilitarian baby covers one young mama makes. A piece of soft nursery print machine quilted to a lining of matching color with dacron between. Much better than blankets, she assured me. They don't fuzz my coat. One young couple brought me a top pieced of the wildest colors, a shocking pink lining and bright green and pink binding. I smiled as I quilted. I bet their tastes will tone down a little in the next few years, and baby will probably crow over this when it makes a pad in his playpen. Oh, isn't that cute? Just now, it is the brightest spot in a drab apartment. An earnest little woman came I love these descriptions. An earnest little woman came staggering up my walk one day, burdened with cotton tops and linings. They are 4 quilts, she said, but before you say you'll do them, I want you to promise to do 8 more. I want every one of my 12 grandkids to have a quilt their grandmother pieced for Christmas. Can you do it by then? But her answer, I was pleased to say I could. 12 quilts by Christmas. That's insane. Machine quilting is faster, is cheaper, is necessary with some materials, and is in keeping with our modern way of life. For quilts to be used with antique bedrooms and for the woman who just loves to quilt by hand quilting is superior. Let's see. Robin has something about... Okay, percale sheet. Oh, wait. So Google says, most percale sheets are made from 100% cotton, but some are made with cotton blends. Okay. Cotton blends can include cotton polyester, silk, or rayon. Cotton blends can be cheaper than 100% cotton sheets, but they may not be as durable or feel as good. And percale sheets are known for being breathable, soft, and durable. They have a tight weave that gives them a smooth feel and a matte finish. Percale sheets are also lightweight and can be a good choice for people who sleep hot or live in warm climates. However, because of their dense cotton threads, percale sheets can be prone to wrinkling, especially if they have a higher thread count. Okay, so yes, thank you. That does, yeah. So I think percale is hard to sew through by hand because it is so dense. And the drip dry percale is the later on stuff that is that it would be like a poly cotton, I think. So yeah, percale. And actually, if you ever get your hands on some like lightly used percale sheets from like 1950 or previous, before they started putting, well, probably 1960 and earlier, before they started doing the blend, they are fantastic. Now, if they've been used, forget about it because they're eventually going to fall apart. But some good unused percale that's vintage is like mwah, chef's kiss for for working with, for applique and stuff. Okay, so page number 4 by Frieda Rollings we have read, and this one, if you remember, Fanny Botts came to her door and was like, I need your help. And she's like, why don't you quilt it yourself? And she says, I don't have a floor space to lay it out. And she says, but Fanny, you could do it on a countertop. And Fanny tricks her into pinning and basting this quilt. All right, so page 5. Joy, so it's interesting how she's always got people coming to her house. Like, that's how she starts these things. So Fanny Botts was at the door, and this earnest little woman came staggering up the walk. So Frieda's always got visitors. Joyce, I say this one's from July, because we're skipping June. We already read that one the other day. Joyce bounded up my walk with a fat roll under her arm and called before she reached the door, I have it rolled and pinned. I had given her directions from my journal on rolling and pinning a quilt, which was in the last month's issue, and told her if she could follow the directions, I would show her how to sew it on the machine. I've rolled a baby quilt and left the lining a little larger than the top as you suggested, Joyce explained. Mom had this cotton I used for filler, but I would have rather used J-Cron. Isn't that funny how today I would say most quilters are gonna pick cotton if they want, I think a lot of modern quilters or contemporary quilters, they love the crinkle, so they'll piece something and then make sure it's cotton, and sometimes even multiple layers of cotton, and then wash it and it crinkles up like an antique quilt. People just like natural fibers. They just don't like polyester. Now I know art quilters they do still use polyester because of different aspects of like she's saying it's puffy or it's not. And then I think, baby quilts and probably quilts that are used in settings like, my grandmother used to make like lap blankets and pillows and things for her aunt who was in a nursing home for an extended period of time. So things that are going to be washed over and over and over and over makes sense to have, polyester in them because it dries faster. But yeah, isn't it funny? Back during this time period, they would have rather had the polyester than the cotton stuff. And I think that's really interesting. Okay. It is better to start with cotton as it is easier to sew, I instructed. Oh, that's interesting. Time enough for Dacron after you have quilted a few quilts. Now let's go to your house and adjust that machine for quilting. On the way, Joyce said her mother had been surprised to learn that just about any sewing machine could be used for quilting. I assured her the main requirement in a machine was space enough to the right of the needle for the rolled up quilt. And it's called throat depth. So if your sewing machine, is shaped like a C, and you got your bed, you need to have enough space between the needle and the motor part of the machine to get the quilt through. And if you don't roll it up tight, you're like trying to shove, 10 pounds of quilt into a 5-pound bag. It's really rough. Joyce had cleaned and oiled her machine, and now she asked, should I increase the pressure on the foot? My home ec teacher says to do that for bulky things. Lots of quilt books will say to increase pressure, but I found it pays to loosen it. I loosen the tension a little with cotton filler, more with Dacron. With the pressure too great, the tendency is to push the puffiness ahead of the quilt. So, yeah. Fluff and stuff. Yeah. So what she's saying is you're going to have that shift if your presser foot is down really hard. It's going to have it's really going to be shoving. So now I'm guessing she's quilting. She's not saying anything about the feed dogs yet. Well, let's keep reading. Let's keep reading. Old-time sewing books used to say to adjust the pressure by placing the material in the number of layers to be sewn under the foot of the machine, lowering the foot onto it and making the pressure just great enough so you couldn't quite pull it through the machine by tugging on the cloth. At this pressure, the feed will easily move the material through the machine. But try this with both more and less pressure and see which you think best. Well, that sounds like frustration because you do it with like a sample bit and you'd have it all perfect, and then you get your quilt in there and it suddenly is like, nah. You will also need to loosen the tension. A good way to tell whether you have loosened it enough is to sew across your quilt once. If you find your lining is puckered or has been taken up too much, you need to loosen it more. Sometimes only the top tension will have to be loosened, but if the top thread is pulled to the bottom, the tension will have to be loosened on the underneath also. Editor's note. This article is the 5th in a series in which Mrs. Rollings, a professional quilter, explains how to quilt on an ordinary home sewing machine. This series will continue for the next few months. So this is interesting how they waited until page 5, like the 5th installment, to tell you what's going on here. I kind of wonder if they just had her like in the beginning, she's just like, I'm going to tell some tales about being a professional quilter. And then they got to the point where they were like, Frieda, you could explain how this is done. I don't know. Yeah, that's interesting. And so that loosening tension, that's one of the things I think when sewing, that drives me crazy. And another reason why I do not like to machine quilt, for the most part, because you do have to pay attention to tension, and tension just can be so finicky with some sewing machines. Now, some sewing machines, really modern ones, you just be like, hey, you'll just, hey, you're gonna sew a quilt. And the machine will say, okay, and it'll put it, not really. But some of these machines can do some amazing things, right? Hey, Kenny. It's good to see you. I mentioned you earlier because I was talking about machines. I don't know if you can, this picture is terrible, but this is Mrs. Frieda Rollings and her singer. I can't tell much about that singer other than I think it's got a padded motor, I think. So, anyway, so yeah, all of those tension adjustments are crazy making. And to me, it's like, if I have to adjust more than the top tension, bottom tension adjustments really depend on your machine. Sometimes it's as much as just adjusting the tension on the bobbin, out of the bobbin case, depending on what your bobbin case is like. That can be crazy. So Yeah. Bless Mrs. Rollings for her simple instructions on, dealing with tension, but ugh. All right. So August 74, we are on the 6th installment. Ooh, a little scale to measure bobbin tension. Interesting. It's funny, I've never had to mess with tension on any of my machines. They seem to automatically know what I need. All right, Robin, then you have one of those rare machines that you say, hey, I want to sew some denim today. And it goes, okay. I remember I went to the original Quilting and Sewing Expo. Gosh, this had to have been like 2013, 2014, because my husband, we had just bought a car. We still have it, and it's a 5-speed Honda Fit, little roller skate of a car. That summer or fall, I went to the original Quilting and Sewing Expo, and I took a class. My mom was with me, and I can't even remember what the class was, but I do remember the sewing machine that we were using. And if you've never been to one of these types of expos, it's it's like there's the quilt show and all the vendors, and then you take a bunch of classes. And then any of the classes that are machine related, you use a sewing machine, they typically have these sewing machine dealers that sponsor the classrooms, and they'll come in and give you the dog and pony show to try and entice you to purchase the machine you have just used in this class, which is all well and good. That's a brilliant marketing. But when I found out how much the machine was and what the special was, I kid you not, this machine cost $10,000 more than I had paid for a car that very year. Now, we got a really good deal on that car, but still, a sewing machine that cost more than my car. And my husband, if I had even had the craziness and the money to buy that, my husband would have divorced me on the spot. What are you thinking, buying a $26,000 sewing machine? Those are the sewing machines that can read your mind. The Singer 461G, it was pure flex. Oh my goodness. Let me put this up here so I can, I'm having trouble seeing the so Kenny's working on a Kenmore model 52. The check spring. I'm familiar with what that is. All right. So moving on to installment number 6. And now the editor is putting in this note. This is the 6th in a series of lessons on machine quilting, which began in issue number 53. Mrs. Rollins will continue to describe her method for machine quilting in the next few issues. Don't unroll it, I protested, but it was too late. The baby quilt Joyce had so neatly rolled and pinned to quilt lay flat on the table. But I'll start in the middle, won't I? Joyce asked, and quilt diagonally? I read somewhere that was easiest. The only time I start in the middle of a quilt is when I just cannot get all the rolled up quilt under the arm of the machine. With your baby quilt, you won't have that trouble. There have been some quilt patterns that have made it necessary for me to quilt diagonally first, but I find myself stretching the quilt out of square when I do. Now roll your quilt up again like you had it so you can quilt across the end, I told her. I'm glad Joyce decided to use the ripple or multi-stitch zigzag on her quilt. Now this is interesting. I don't know that I would do something like this. Can you see what she did? That is a single step zigzag. So a multi-step zigzag goes like this. Right? A single step zigzag just goes, right? So, I don't like this, Mrs. Rollins. I don't like this at all. So Joyce's mother said, you say she can quilt right down the seams? Some of her seams weren't too strong, so it should last better. Well, Joyce's mother, I guess you're saying something rude about Joyce's quilt. Yes, and the ripple stitch will stretch and stand strains that would pop a straight stitch, I reminded them. This is interesting. see, Robin says, the quilting on my Sue's quilt is zigzag. Oh, okay. Interesting. I think I have a couple of old quilts, 60s, 70s that had zigzag. The problem with the zigzag stitching, depending on, if it's big like this, talk about a toenail catcher. I mean, that does get caught on stuff because it's going to be like a stitch that's 1/4 of an inch long or more. So, Joyce's quilt was a pastel 9 patch made of 3-inch blocks with a 3-inch white strip to set it together. Her blue lining was fairly bright, so I thought blue thread of the same shade would set it off well. Joyce had adjusted her stitch and length so the ripples were the way she wanted them. And so with the roll on her left, she started sewing down the first row of blocks. Keep your top and lining straight and control the puff by placing your hands flat on either side of the needle. After each line of stitching, you pull the quilt back and start another line at the same end you started the first. You will unroll the quilt on the left and roll it up tightly on the right as you go. Remove the pins before you get too close to them, as they may be holding a pleat to the lining. Ugh, and that's the part that I'm going like, ugh. That's what's frustrating. With not too much ripping, Joyce managed to sew all the crosswise seams. Then she re-rolled the quilt lengthwise and started quilting down the seams. Occasionally, a tiny pleat developed where 2 lines of quilting crossed, but by taking it slower and holding down the puff, she had less and less trouble. Also, she was inclined to sew faster at the end of each seam, and this made the ripple stitch wider apart. I cautioned her to hold her speed constant. We were all proud of the quilt when she finished it. And so this says this is a sample block quilted by Mrs. Rollings. Black thread was used to show the ripple stitch clearly. This looks like what she described that Joyce's quilt looks like, but, again, it looks nice. But I dare say that, while it would have the strength this way, I do feel like those zigzags would catch things. One of my Sunbonnet Sue quilts, the Sues, and they're more colonial lady, but they're held down with a really tight, it's more of a satin stitch than a zigzag, but then there's zigzags that hold things together and the whole quilt together, and they're pulled, like they got caught on stuff and got pulled. So I think that would be what's frustrating about that. All right, page 7. Did you just accidentally make your seams cross in the middle of the plain blocks like that? Mrs. Townley asked when I brought out the double wedding ring I had quilted for her. When you said you couldn't follow the curves on the quilt, I supposed you'd just make squares all over and they'd fall any which way. So, with the double wedding ring, what she's saying is, on a domestic machine, I can't do this. I can't turn things. Now, has anybody ever quilted something on a domestic machine that was just, straight lines is what you generally have to do on a domestic machine. But has anybody ever tried to quilt a curve? I have done a concentric circle on a twin-sized quilt. And first of all, it will give you a great shoulder workout. It is intense because you're constantly doing this. You're constantly turning and rolling it and turning it and rolling it. So I understand why Mrs. Rollings would say, I cannot do the curve quilting. But it's funny that Mrs. Townley just assumed that she'd just be making squares all over the place. Druid said yes. Yeah. I spend enough time measuring the figure out. I spend enough time measuring to figure out a pattern that will show up the piecing best, I told her. When I have a plain spot, like the middle of the wedding ring, I try especially hard to make that pretty. So Druid says, I have a setting that makes a wave. I did that, but not circles. Okay. So Oh, Marita made flowers by turning a twin size. Oh, so like a concentric thing, like a, or just like a flower pattern. Ooh, because if it's a flower pattern, oh bless her, that's some work. Mrs. Townley said she didn't see how I did it. I explained to her that I first roll the quilt up so I could sew across the end. Then I sew through the pickle dish. That's the thing in the middle, is I guess what she's calling it. It's funny though, pickle dish is really it's a different pattern than a double wedding ring. It's still the football shapes or the circles, but you've got instead of just solid curves or the they wouldn't be rectangles, they're like parallelograms. Instead of those, it's triangles, and so it's much more complex, a pickle dish. And so what she's showing is not really a pickle dish. A vine, leaves, and flowers on a border. Oh wow, I too would have been dumbfounded because that's pretty amazing. So good for her. Okay, so then I sew through the pickle dish for my first row of quilting, down the side of it with my second, through the middle of the plain block, and then down the sides of the other pickle dish. Oh, you know what? She's not calling that center the pickle dish. She's calling, so you've got the football shape. She's calling that center piece the pickle dish. That little, really tight little, I'll show you a picture in a second. So she says figure 1 shows the rows in numerical order. Then I roll it lengthwise and quilt it just the same way, leaving big squares, which figure 2. Then I roll it diagonally, quilting every other row of blocks and making sure that a row runs through the middle of the plain block. Finally, I roll it diagonally again and quilt the unquilted squares in the other direction. So this is what she's talking about. So you can see in this first one, she's just doing the straights, and then she turns the quilt 90 degrees to do this. And I think what she's saying when she says going through the middle of the pickle dish, this is what she's talking about. Doing one through the middle. She's calling this piece here, I think, the pickle dish. Then she's doing the 2 different diagonal quilting. So that ends up being very pretty, I think. Very simple, very plain. But it ends up, because she does, I think, if I'm looking at this right, because she's doing every other intersection with the diagonal, she ends up with the center is sort of quilted bigger, I think. Right? Maybe not. I don't know. But I like what she's saying here is that, to do these up and down and then do these and then you do the diagonals last, because the diagonals would pull the quilt out of, because you're dealing with bias. Whereas if you, get things tacked down with the regular straight of grain grid, then when you're getting those diagonals in there, then it's already pretty strong. By using a ripple stitch, I could quilt right down the seam on 9 patches, pinwheels, etc. A zigzag stitch is good for this also, and the other day I saw a baby quilt made of tiny tumblers of blue and white quilted with a scallop stitch. I like the idea of having a continuous thread running from the binding on one side to the binding on the other, rather than having to tie off and start again some way in the middle. Here are some patterns I like to use, so I'll show you those in a second. Yeah, that's another thing that is really irritating about doing any kind of complicated patterns, is that edge to edge, you don't end up having, threads to bury. So it's really nice how you can just across it. These are the patterns that she's talking about, and again, it's more of this diagonal type stuff. And then, so this is the 7th in a series. So then they've got this on the page. I don't think, and this says it's a border pattern. I do not think this is part of Frieda Rollings. this border quilting pattern, because to me it looks like it's supposed to be hand quilting. And I don't think this is actually hard to do, you guys, like hand quilting. Because it just doesn't you end up having to travel underneath, like between the layers, to pick up the beginnings or ends of each of the feathers. Like, you know, if you started, if you started here, right there, and then quilted to there, then you have to travel below to get to the bottom of this one, and then quilt it back, and then travel underneath to get to the, you know. And this is actually probably easier than what I've been doing on a piece I'm working on that's a wreath. So forget about doing this on a machine. Now, how feathers are done on a long arm, there's a like steps for that, how you do it. But hand piecing, I was really surprised how challenging that is. Okay, moving right along. We are on page 8 now of Pages from a Quilter's Journal by Frieda Rollings. So this is the 8th in a series, and this one is October of 74. I was a year old at that point. I found Kathy in tears and the 6-pointed star she had been trying to piece in the wastebasket. But Kathy, I remonstrated, you were doing so well with your 9 patches that it never occurred to me the star would present a problem. What happened? When I made the 9 patches, Kathy told me, I took the square you gave me for a pattern, drew around it on my material, and cut it out on the line. Then I put the pieces together and made a 1/4-inch seam by using a guide on the sewing machine. When I looked at this diamond, though, the quilting book said, add seams. It explained that you should draw around the pattern given, estimate a 1/4-inch out from the line to cut, and then sew on the line. I guess the 1/4-inch I estimated wasn't always true, because when I sewed on the top line, I didn't always hit the bottom line, and it's a mess. She rescued the mess from the wastebasket for me to see. Kathy's block had a hump in the center where all the seams came together. I've been there, Kathy. I feel your pain. Well, Kathy, most of the books give you the same instructions you have followed here. But if they don't work for you, why don't you just add the 1/4-inch seam to your pattern and proceed as you did with the 9 patch? I'll try it, she said. First, she drew the diamond pattern. Being careful to measure accurately, she placed dots a 1/4-inch out from the line and connected them to enlarge it. Then she cut it out on the new line. I wish it didn't have that long tail on it, she said. When I get to the middle, I have trouble with them. If you don't like it, cut it off, I told her, and then had to laugh at her shocked expression. I picked up the diamond she had just cut and drew around it. Then I drew a broken line represented the seam line. If you trim the points at each end, you will just be cutting away the seam, I explained. You should be sure to cut outside your seam line, or you might end up with a hole in the center of your block. A little later, Kathy whooped into my house with a perfectly made 6-pointed star. And this is what she's talking about. Just lopping off those little ears. Now, I personally would not lop off those little ears until you're done piecing. I mean, if you're hand piecing, it's probably not a big deal. But if you're going to machine piece something like this, you know, you mark, especially if you're dealing with something set in, you really mark those, you know, the little points where your needle is going to stop and have to go in a different direction. And then you cut those little dog ears off later. You know, you press and then you cut them if you need to. Those little dog ears can be helpful at times. Make sure you have enough fabric. Yes, we are all Kathy. We have all been Kathy. We are probably all still Kathy. Yeah, there was something I was working on recently. It was one of my Mary Witherwax blocks, and I had just trimmed it too close, and I was trying to push some seam allowance under, and the fabric was just fraying, and I was like, I'm ready to just cut this thing into pieces. I salvaged it, though. Okay, we're in the home stretch here. Page 9. I saw Kathy's grandmother today, and she was thanking me for showing Kathy how to piece a quilt. I tried to tell her that she didn't have to trace around the smaller pieces, that she could hold the pattern firmly on the material and cut around it, since you had shown her how to add the seam allowance to the pattern. But she considered you the final authority, she laughed. Oh, I see what she's talking about. She's talking about you take the pattern piece, you lay it on the fabric, and you just... Now that's a way to make a funky, uneven quilt. Good job, grandmother. Children will listen to anyone better than their relative, I assured her. I just wanted Kathy's first endeavors to be as nearly perfect as possible, so she would be unsatisfied with sloppy workmanship. I knew most older women turn out perfect quilts without ever drawing around a pattern. You know, Frieda, some of them don't. And we have the receipts to prove it. Some of them whacked stuff out and made, and I'm not saying this one's bad, but just made some quilts that are very questionable. I knew most older women turn out perfect quilts without ever drawing around a pattern. I've always felt cutting quilt pieces by just holding the pattern on it was a technique that had to be learned. Do you think Kathy is ready for it? She told me today she was awfully bored with all that tracing. Yeah, but that's if you're going to make a quilt this way, you got to do the tracing. If we don't relieve her of some of it, I think she may be hunting out a new handicraft. Oh, that would be a shame. I'll tell Kathy what a fine idea her grandmother has had, and we both laughed. Kathy was surprised when I championed her grandmother's rather unorthodox way of cutting a quilt. I explained that everyone had her own idea how a quilt should be made. The thing that determines whether a procedure works for an individual or not is the joy they find in creating and the excellence of the final product, I told her. Kathy said she was tired of tracing. I've been intending to make Amy a doll quilt, so I'll try 4-patch that way, she agreed. Well, 4-patch rotary cutter. Don't even try this. Like hold the template up and eyeball it. Just get a rotary cutter. Sadly, they didn't have rotary cutters here in the 70s. And Kathy, I told her, don't be ashamed to throw away some of your first cuttings if they are imperfect. You should make yourself more than one pattern, so if you accidentally trim a pattern, it can be discarded. Patterns cut from sandpaper are good as they cling to the material when turned rough side down. This was something my mom used a lot. The next day I saw Kathy. She said she had to throw away a few imperfect squares and one pattern she had trimmed. But, she said, I do believe when I get onto it a little better, it will save me loads of time. The hardest part is holding the pattern on the straight of the material. To be concluded next month. And here we go. This is the conclusion. It's kind of interesting that this final article does not really doesn't really keep going on what Kathy was doing. So this is the final article in the series. It's December 74. Assuming this is the final article, 75, who knows? I'm going to have to search and see if I have a 75. I think I might have a 75. I have to look and see. Okay. Since issue number 56, March 74, Quilter's newsletter has been running Pages from a Quilter's Journal by Frieda Rollings. Mrs. Rollings is a professional quilt maker who specializes in machine quilting on her home sewing machine. In the past 5 years, she has quilted almost 800 quilts on her 18-year-old Singer. In her series, Mrs. Rollings explained her methods for piecing quilts, preparing them for quilting, and machine quilting them. To conclude this series, we have summarized some of her techniques and suggestions below. So first, if you want a really puffy quilt, use a polyester filler, not cotton, and do not quilt it too close. Quilting lines need not be closer than 3 or 4 inches, can be up to 6 inches apart. The puffier you wish the quilt to be, the less you should quilt it. Hand quilting is not necessarily better than machine quilting. On some quilts, and for some purposes, machine quilting is superior. Some contemporary fabrics, like denim, sailcloth, bonded knits, and corduroy, are difficult or impossible to hand quilt. Hey, Kate! Oh, I'm so glad you were here. Hope you have a good day. Drip dry sheets are hard to hand quilt also, if they are used for a lining. For these fabrics, machine quilting is the answer. It is the answer also if you need to finish a quilt in a hurry. Machine quilting is faster, cheaper, necessary with some materials, and in keeping with our modern way of life. Okay, next. When preparing a quilt for quilting, you do not have to stretch it on frames or lay it out on the floor. You can use a large table and pin the layers together section by section, rolling up the pinned sections as you go. Both quilt top and lining should be carefully ironed first. Some pieced quilts grow under the iron, some getting so much bigger when pressed that linings measured before the ironing are found to be too small. Any home sewing machine can be used for quilting, the main requirement being an adequate space to the right of the needle for a rolled up quilt. Loosen the pressure on the machine before quilting. It should be loosened a little with cotton filler, more with polyester filler. The tension should be loosened also, usually on the top only, but sometimes on both top and bottom threads. The ripple or zigzag stitch is good for machine quilting because it will stretch and stand strains that would pop a straight stitch. Although it is difficult to follow curves when machine quilting, the quilting design need not be limited to squares which have no relationship with the pieced pattern on the top. Straight line designs can be worked out which complement the pattern, such as those sketched below. We don't really have anything sketched here, so I believe that was meant for, I think it was week 8, week 7. Yeah. Or I'm sorry, page 7. If possible, it is preferable to have a continuous thread running from the binding on one side to the binding on the other, rather than having to tie off and start again in the middle of the quilt. Most quilt books include patterns without seam allowance and direct that a 1/4 inch allowance be added by eye when cutting. Oh, and you know what? Don't let me forget about this. So added by eye when cutting. If you prefer to piece by machine and like to work with a pattern that includes the seam allowance, simply measure the allowance and draw it on the pattern template before cutting it out. Then, when you mark around your templates on the fabric, you will be marking your cutting line rather than your seam line. If you are using a pattern template that includes the seam allowance as above, it is not essential that you mark around it on the fabric before cutting. With a little practice, you can cut the patches by carefully holding the template on the fabric and cutting around it. It is a technique that has to be learned, but it does save a lot of tedious marking. If you accidentally trim off the edge of your template, throw it away and make a new one. And finally, everyone has her own idea of how a quilt should be made. The thing that determines whether a procedure works for an individual or not is the joy he or she finds in creating and the excellence of the final product. So it says next month we will continue with lesson number 44, intermediate course number 2. I don't know what that is. But you guys, I found this a while back and forgot to show it because I'd mentioned it on a previous stream. It's the quilter's disc. See? It's the little brass disc that you'd put up against the edge of a template, and then you put a pencil or some kind of marking thing in that little hole, and then you roll it along the edge of your template with a pencil, and it creates a 1/4 inch. It is exactly a 1/2 inch wide with the hole in the middle at a 1/4 inch. So this is kind of a fun thing. It was a really smart little and ingenious invention, I guess, and at the time was 85 cents. I think they're like $5 now. I know I've seen them in quilt stores still, but anyway, yeah. Oh, they make what your husband made you one. Oh, that's cool. Was it out of metal, or is he like a metal worker, or he just has those skills? So, yeah. All right. So that was really interesting. Frieda Rollings' business and these women that she helped. It was funny. It was an interesting one. So, all right. Oh, aircraft mechanic. Okay. Awesome. Yes. My dad was a welder, and he often would make interesting metal things around our house. he tended not to be like a finish guy, you know, like he did not have like an angle grinder to make things nice and smooth and neat. So some of the things he made would be a little bit lumpy, but okay. So, are you ready for beauty in business? So as a reminder, we are reading The Lady of Godey's, Sarah Josepha Hale, by Ruth E. Finley. And this is about Sarah Hale, who was the editor of Godey's magazine back in the 1800s. It was not the first women's magazine, but the first women's fashion magazine. And it's used extensively today, particularly in costuming, because it's got like all of the fashions from the 1800s in it, basically. So we've learned about Louis Godey. We've learned about, Mrs. Hale and how she got there. So now I think we're going to get into what the deal with this magazine was, hopefully. So this is chapter 5, Beauty in Business. Mrs. Hale did not leave Boston for Philadelphia immediately upon the consolidation of her ladies' magazine with the ladies' book. A mother first, an editor afterward, she insisted on remaining near Harvard in order to make a home for her youngest son, William, until he was graduated. For it was not personal glory that 9 years before had called her from Newport. Her own success as an individual, however well cultivated, was secondary. Uppermost in her mind since the day her husband died had been the care and education of her children. Oh, you got Sarah Hale. I mean, what a fantastic woman. I kind of think at this time period, most women would, default to their children. But I feel like, I think it's probably really easy for women to, get very tied up in a career. I mean, especially these days, and, their children don't have a good relationship with them, or their children get slighted. So in accordance with the spirit of the times, she confessed this fully to her public, a frankness which 20th century commentators have criticized. What? They see no reason why a woman should solicit patronage on the ground that she is a widow with a family to support. Nor is there such reason today. The modern wife may suffer the grief of personal loss, but not necessarily does this involve economic tragedy. Well, Ruth, I still think it's hard to be a widow today, particularly if you're a young widow. Luckily, I think we have, we die less at a young age these days, but still, being a widow with young children, it's hard. And if you don't have a family to help you, I'll step off my soapbox before I even get started. 100 avenues in the business world are open to her, and society has little cause to set her apart as entitled to more than its sympathetic cooperation. But in 1822, conditions were different. Financially, the family was entirely dependent on the husband and father. Like it wasn't in the 20th century, too. I mean, come on, Ruth. He only was permitted contact with the greater economic whole. Once death had removed him, there was no one that might take his place. In truth, he left no place. Ordinarily, a family bereaved of its supporting head was broken up. First the funeral, then the dispersal. The children were scattered among the homes of whatever relatives and friends could be persuaded to take an orphan to raise. Are you an orphan if your mom is still alive? I guess so. Somehow the widow might shift for herself, but often she too became the intruding object of kinship's responsibility. Oh, God forbid you have to take care of your poor widowed relative. Sarah Hale did not choose, a favorite Yankeeism with her, as with Mr. Coolidge, to accept this traditional mode of charity. She would keep her children together. Keeping them together, she had to feed their bodies and train their minds. Money must be earned. You know what? Did I? Sorry, guys. I think I was leaning on my keyboard because there's a funky thing going on with my... Okay. So money had to be earned. Out into a world totally unaccustomed to a woman seeking moneyed success, she took the essential qualification, a trained brain, however unpopular in a woman, for the accomplishment to her end. But obviously, the widow Hale must ask patronage for her Pioneer magazine on the ground of support for her children. That was a recourse her public could understand. All it could understand. Truly, Mrs. Hale had set herself a stupendous task. You know what? Like, okay, this kind of makes me mad because it's like, oh, asking for support for your business endeavor is not okay. I'm not even gonna. You guys feel my consternation here. Truly, Mrs. Hale had set herself a stupendous task. Not the support alone, but the thorough education of her 5 boys and girls. It remained in her memory always as the supreme effort of her life. Nothing she accomplished in after years equaled in her estimation this crowning achievement of her Boston experience. As late as 1852, when the 5th edition of Northwood was brought out, recollection of the struggle and its happy outcome still loomed so large in her thought that she began her word with the reader, or preface, by saying the following. 25 years ago, the book you are about to read was written, and thus commenced my literary life. To those who know me, and remember, Northwood is what she's talking about, her book. It was a book of poems, I think, wasn't it? To those who know me, it is also known that this was not entered upon to win fame, but as a support for my little children. The success of my literary life has enabled me to educate my children liberally, as their father would have done. Certainly, Lawyer Hale could have educated them no better, but they were a brilliant brood, destined all 5 to justify their mother's struggle. David, the eldest boy, was 13 when Mrs. Hale removed to Boston. The following year, he received an appointment to West Point. In 1833, he was graduated 8th in rank, the youngest of his class of 150. He was commissioned lieutenant of the 1st Artillery, then stationed at Beaufort, South Carolina, and later served throughout the Seminole War in Florida. Just after New Year of 1839, he was ordered to the Canadian line to help protect the border during the difficulty with England over the steamer Caroline. The sudden change of climate, exposing him to the intense cold of a northern winter after the warmth of the south, induced hemorrhages, and he died at Plattsburgh, April 30th, 1839, at the age of 25. Well, that is super sad, but I do not understand how you have hemorrhages induced by going from warm to cold. Because I think we do that all the time. People all the time would fly from Florida, the heat of Florida, to Canada in the winter and do not die of a hemorrhage. So that's odd. And I'm wondering what exactly his medical situation was. If you guys have any idea, let me know. If you're as confused as I, we move on. After David's premature death, his mother was more than ever determined to remain on guard in Boston over her youngest son. With her 2 girls at Mrs. Willard's school in Troy, it had seemed sensible for William to board on the campus and his mother to go to Philadelphia, especially as an early attempt to publish the ladies' book simultaneously in the 2 cities had failed. But now she must continue to edit Godey's from Boston, despite the handicap of the 350 slow, uncertain miles between her editorial desk and the point of publication. Can you imagine how hard this was? I mean, in today, an editor, no big deal. They could live anywhere, and materials could be, emailed to them, put in a Dropbox, etc., etc. But, yeah, this being 350 miles, I mean, somebody had to ride a horse to get things in between Boston and Philadelphia. The death of her oldest boy had left her no heart to find place in new surroundings. So, okay, so Druid says, temperature fluctuates, why can't I say that? Temperature fluctuations can affect the body in many ways, including blood flow. When the temperature shifts from warm to cool, it can trigger a Raynaud attack, which can cause bleeding. Raynaud phenomenon, a disruption in the body's control system, can cause attacks, which can be triggered by cold temperatures or temperature shifts. Even mild exposure to cold, like air conditioning or refrigerated food, can cause an attack. My dad actually has Raynaud's. I actually know a little about this. And I guess it's probably an issue of how severe it is, but it's a circulatory issue. So like his hands, like even in the dead of summer, will be like corpse hands. They're so cold. And same with his feet. So yeah, I guess that could have been something. I guess he could have had circulatory issues. So yeah, I don't know, but I mean, Raynaud's, I've not necessarily heard of bleeding, but that's modern. That's modern. I don't know with this situation. Gosh, at 25 too. Very interesting. Okay, so she wrote to Louis Godey. It is not a common loss that I mourn. I depended on him as a friend. I cannot at once summon fortitude to enter on the occupations of a world so dark and desolate as this now appears. So she kind of thought of her kid as a friend. And so she stayed with William until his senior year, when her presence in Philadelphia became so imperative that delay was no longer possible. She reached Philadelphia in 1841. It was her home for the remaining 38 years of her life. Meanwhile, Horatio, her second son, who at a later date might have joined up with an Amundsen, a Scot or bird, was already in the Antarctic. Her son went to the Antarctic. He had been graduated from Harvard in 1837, but so remarkable was his talent for languages that while still an undergraduate, he was awarded the post of philologist to the United States Exploring Expedition, Captain Charles Wilkes commanding, the first of its kind to be authorized by Congress. Wow. The expedition left Hampton Roads in August 1838 and was gone 4 perilous years. So Hampton Roads, I'm assuming we're talking, well, I can't assume anything. Hampton Roads is in Virginia, but maybe there is a Hampton Roads that's in the Northeast as well. I'm not sure. Because we're talking about Boston and yeah. But then when they talk about Amundsen, Scott, and Bird, well, we'll move on. The expedition left Hampton Roads in August 38 and was gone for 4 perilous years. After stopping at many ports in South America, the Samoan Islands, and New South Wales, Captain Wilkes sailed into the Antarctic regions. In due time, he reported he had found land at a number of points. In 1841, he and his party started home by way of the Pacific, exploring en route the west coast of North America and making records that were to prove most valuable in the coming dispute between America and Great Britain over the Oregon Territory. For those West Coast reports, special credit is due Horatio Hale, who left the expedition at the Columbia River and proceeded into the interior alone. One of the officers of the flagship on which young Hale had made the voyage wrote the boy's mother. U.S. ship Vincennes, Bay of San Francisco, October 30th, 1841. Madam, believing it will afford you pleasure to hear from your son, H. Hale, Esquire, through me, as he may not have been aware of the present opportunity to forward letters to you, I take the liberty of informing you that he remains in Oregon Territory for a few weeks, then proceeds to this port. After spending 2 or 3 months in this interesting country, he will proceed to Mexico. Captain Wilkes gave him these orders in compliance with his request, as he was of the opinion that he would be able to gain much valuable information. I am, madam, yours most, I'm guessing, respectfully. He has shortened this to yours, MST, which I'm assuming is most, and then RESPY. I'm guessing most respectfully. R.R. Waldron. Horatio Hale's findings on this solo trip excited great scientific interest. Can you imagine? I mean, he's a young man and he's like just going out on his own into the Oregon Territory. His first book, Ethnography and Philology, Volume 6 of the unfinished official record of the Wilkes expedition, is an exhaustive treatise of 665 pages and is still regarded as authoritative. At the age of 25, he was hailed by English as well as American scientists as one of the great philologists of his day. His later research among the languages and dialects of the North American Indians, made at a time when there were still left remnants of many tribes now extinct, enabled him to tap living sources soon to become unavailable. His work remains invaluable. Gee, I'm wondering why some of those tribes were then extinct. Could be these people in the Oregon Territory, taking it all for their own. Incidentally, it is tragic to note that the expedition that won fame for Horatio Hale ended unjustly in mere notoriety for his commander, Captain Wilkes. For 90 years, Wilkes' claim of having discovered 8 new lands in the Antarctic region, suggesting a continent, have stood discredited, Wilkes' land alone being accepted. He became a phantom among explorers. And then in 1930, Sir Douglas Mawson, sent to the Antarctic in the wake of Byrd to represent Great Britain, flew by airplane south from the final anchorage of his ship and found land in areas closely corresponding to those reported by Captain Wilkes. So closely as to prove conclusively the truth of Wilkes' claims. After almost a century, the biggest liar in the Navy, he who later was just to miss causing war between England and the northern states by his removal of Confederate commissioners from HMS Trent, has been vindicated by an Englishman. The story of William Hale would make an excellent theme for a Wild West romance. After graduating from Harvard, second in his class, he went south and was admitted to the Bar of Virginia in 1845. Then, in 1846, he moved on to Galveston, where he became renowned for his handling of the old Spanish claims, which immediately flooded the courts of Texas upon its separation from Mexico. These disputes between the Dons and the squatters were of such a nature that any lawyer touching them literally took his life in his own hands. Once William Hale was captured by the notorious bandit Canales, who for years terrorized the border. Another time, he just missed drinking of a case of poisoned wine sent him as a gift. Again, his life was saved by a remorseful servant who fell at his feet as he was about to begin breakfast and confessed to having been bribed to put ground glass in his food. Wow! This is some intrigue in Galveston. No complete history of Texas can be written without mention of William Hale. Amaradim, if you're still here, you're Texas, right? Is William Hale part of your history? Did you learn about him? He was a beneficent power in his adopted state, whose university's law school even yet includes his cases in its course as models of argument. It was William's need as a little boy, self-support having called his mother outside the home, that roused Mrs. Hale's interest in what later came to be known as kindergartens, or more modernly, nursery schools. I completely forgot about this. She was a proponent of kindergarten. Okay, 7th grade history. You learned about William Hale. Well, now you learn about his mother. Let's see. William, under 6 years old and wearing dresses when he arrived in Boston. Galveston was a big deal. Gotcha. You know, it's so funny. I won't digress too much, but I had this discussion with somebody not long ago, and it was, you know, you think about history, and I feel like often, you know, particularly like meeting people from the UK or Europe, they'll kind of, I don't know, they kind of give you a lot of crap about like, oh, you don't know about this history? Oh, you never learned about this history? The thing is, like, the history of the United States, even though, you know, we're only, 250 years old, is so complicated and there's so many different things that happen in all of these different places. It's really hard to cram anything else into kids learning, and so you often will end up with like these very localized instruction about history. So like, I mean, all of my history classes were, you know, tons and tons of Virginia history, which happened to include the Civil War and the Revolutionary War and, you know, some of the founding of the nation kind of stuff. Whereas people in other states, you know, they get the history of their own state and then some of those secondary things when there's time. So, okay. So William is still wearing dresses when he gets to Boston with his mother, and forthwith went to an infant school, or rather the school came to him. 7th grade was exclusively Texas history. Yeah, I don't even remember 7th grade history. I don't even remember what we were learning. Tradition, in fact, has it that the first school of this kind, as differentiated from the dame school, was held in Mrs. Hale's house and under her direction. In payment for William's instruction, she permitted his governess. She's poor, but they still have a governess. I mean, I guess a working mom, no matter how poor she is, does need help. But, you know, a governess. She permitted his governess to gather a few of the neighborhood children into the nursery, where the young woman conducted classes in accordance with Mrs. Hale's own ideas of child culture. Child culture. I love it. Let's see. We had history of the Civil War, but mostly had the gold rush. Yeah. So California, absolutely. You know, and I have a very good friend who grew up in Sacramento, and she was like, gold rush is, you know, like that was all of our history, and, you know, the building of San Francisco and all that stuff. So yeah, you know, regionally, we really have differences in our education. In the February 1829 issue of the Ladies' Magazine, Mrs. Hale published a long article written by herself explaining the desirability of educational guidance for infants. I like this. I think an infant means any child like under the age of 6 or under the age of whatever, older than 6, I guess, because William is 6 and he's being called an infant. It's funny though, also at this time period, these infants this age were working in factories too. Well, later on, but yeah, the infants, they're infants until they're working in a factory. The theories and arguments she advanced are so at variance with the period's thought, or lack of it, on child training that there can be little doubt as to their originality. Out of her 7 years' experience as a teacher, and twice then as a mother, she had gained an understanding of child psychology far from shared by her times. When it was remembered that it was not until some years later that Dickens felt constrained to take up educational cudgels on behalf of older children, the novelty of Mrs. Hale's proposal is emphasized. The very small child, she argued, stood in need of an individual development that would antedate the merging of its personality in the larger and more strictly disciplined classroom. How they justify the low wages and abuse, yes. Well, women and children are... yeah, there you go. In line with its efforts to popularize infant schools, the Ladies' Magazine opened a department of child psychology called Letters from a Mother. These letters were written by the editor. Quaint and old-fashioned as they seem now, they were radical to the point of controversy in their own illiberal days, when the first, last, and only precept of childhood was to be seen and not heard. And they paved the way for more infant schools. In the September issue for 1829, Mrs. Hale's magazine triumphantly announced the establishment in Boston of a second school. Sarah Hale's interest in the kindergarten idea, active during her entire editorial career, was intensified following her own experiment by her close friendship with Elizabeth Peabody. It was Elizabeth Peabody who introduced the Froebel system in America. True to her belief in higher education for women, Mrs. Hale sent her 2 daughters to Emma Willard's female seminary at Troy, New York, when the most advanced girls' school in the country. Not for more than another quarter of a century was there to be established Vassar College, the world's first institution of collegiate rank for women. At Troy, the younger Sarah Josepha, commonly called Josepha, trained for a teacher. After graduation, she taught in a private school in Georgia for a number of years before opening her own successful and fashionable boarding and day school for young ladies at 1826 Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. No school kept by a daughter of her mother could be other than well conducted, and the indefatigable, I have a hard time saying that, indefatigable principal continued her classes even to her last hour. She died at her desk between two recitation periods, May 3rd, 1863. She had never married. Frances Ann, Mrs. Hale's older daughter, married in 1844, Dr. Lewis Boudinot Hunter of Princeton and Philadelphia, a naval surgeon. In the Hunter house at 1413 Locust Street, Philadelphia, the lady editor spent the last decades of her life surrounded by an adoring half dozen of Hunter grandchildren. It is the two of these grandchildren still living, Colonel Charles Hunter and Mrs. Sarah Hale Hunter, and to Mr. Charles Hale, son of Horatio Hale, that the writer is indebted for the major personal details of Mrs. Hale's life. So this was 1931, that these two grandchildren were able to give Ruth Finley some information. That's interesting. Let's see. Frieda Rollings was a German pedagogue who laid the foundation for modern education based on the recognition that children have unique needs and capabilities. Yeah. Among the many charming memories these three individually retain of her, two in particular are shared in common: her love for children and her physical beauty. So I'm thinking that's where the beauty in business came from. I'm waiting for this whole thing about the fashion stuff, but yeah. Sarah Hale was strikingly beautiful in an era when the prettiest women were considered old and looked it at 40. She was lovely at 60. Artists never left off importuning her to sit to them. The most popular paintings of her, which were also considered the best likenesses by her family, are the portraits by W.B. Chambers, done expressly for the 20th anniversary of Godey's Lady's Book in 1850, when Mrs. Hale was 62, and an almost simultaneous canvas by Thomas Buchanan Reed, author of Sheridan's Ride, known to posterity as a poet rather than a portrait painter. Interesting. These pictures seem almost too youthful, too animated for a woman past 60, even in the eyes of a generation accustomed to dancing grandmothers. Yet daguerreotypes taken at even later period confirm both artists' unflattering accuracy. The pitiless, truthful camera of the mid-19th century records the same firm, unwrinkled skin and gentle contours. But Chambers and Reed depicted an inner something also. Each caught the spirit of her tremendous vitality. Reed knew her intimately. From 1845 to 1848, many of his poems appeared in Godey's. So Druid says, Froebel created the concept of the kindergarten and coined the word, which soon entered the English language as well. He also developed the educational toys known as Froebel gifts. I'll have to learn more about that. That's interesting. Okay. There's a picture in here, but it does not help with anything related to what we have just read. But this says, in the 40s, so 1840s, sleeves were tight and bonnets became pokes. So this is what the ladies looked like in the 1840s. So by the 1860s? Or is it the 1830s? I can't remember. At some point, it's either in the decades before this or the decades after this, they still had this really tight shoulder situation going on. You couldn't lift your arms above your shoulders. But the sleeves were big. You had these insane sleeves. So I'm going to stop right there because we've still got a lot to go here in this chapter. Yeah. it's moving in. It's moving into areas it's unexpected to me. So yeah, we'll finish this up on Thursday. Yeah, this appears to be getting into. Okay, I'm not going to read ahead. This seems to be getting into some of Sarah Hale's beauty secrets for how she kept herself beautiful. And I'm curious to know, did that stuff end up in the magazine? We'll have to find out. So, as a reminder, if you didn't catch it at the top of the stream, Thursday will be a regular stream as usual, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And then next week, we'll get into the pre-recorded stuff that Jill and I have put together. And those will come out at 2 p.m. But they'll be on the Quilt Nerding YouTube. So if you want to see those. And let's see what else. I think that's everything. Yeah. I hope you guys have a wonderful week. And if you are following along with our quilt nerding stuff, tomorrow we are going to start talking about soft covers for hard times. Or no, we're not. I'm sorry. Yeah. Tomorrow is actually our free period. We are starting this after seminar. I can't believe I'm such a ding dong. Yeah, this gets started after seminar. Although I'm going to start reading. Yeah, Jill and I are doing kind of a bit of a potpourri show tomorrow. So if you follow along with us, we'll see you. If not, and you're free tomorrow night, stop by, because it's actually not about a book tomorrow. I'm sorry. Too much stuff going on, y'all. Okay. Have a wonderful week. I hope to see you tomorrow. If not tomorrow, Thursday. And I am always grateful for you guys. Couldn't do this without you. So take care. Have a great afternoon. And I'll see you on the flip side. Mwah!